Hi, my name's John Clinton, and I'm the CEO of Edelman in Canada. I'm here today to talk to you about the state of trust, and I'm doing that on behalf of Philanthropy Partners. There's probably nothing more important in our relationships, whether it be business, family, or otherwise, than trust. And Edelman has made a science of studying trust. Over the last 14 years, the Edelman Trust Barometer has become the largest study of trust in the world, taking place in over 27 countries, over 33,000 respondents. The Trust Barometer measures trust in institutions like NGOs, like media, like government, and like business. What we saw in 2014 was that business must lead the debate for change. For the first time in a long time, we saw a big gap between the difference in trust in business and the trust in government, and we'll talk more about that later. But trust is shaped by the events of the year. It's shaped by the economy, but it's also shaped by what happens during the year. It's in Canada, it was shaped by the Senate debacles. It was shaped by the surprise election results in British Columbia and Ontario. It was shaped by the antics of a mayor in Toronto. It was shaped by the leaks from Edward Snowden. It was shaped by the flooding in Calgary. It was shaped by the collapse of factories in Bangladesh. All of those issues combining to make people trust certain institutions more and certain institutions less. So why does trust matter? I'm sure there are lots of opinions, but the reason we think it's so important is trust measures two things. It looks at reputation and trust. Now, the problem with reputation is it's looking backwards. It's telling you what's happened in the past. Whereas what we believe is trust predicts what will happen in the future. I trust that person, therefore I will invest with them. I trust that person, therefore I will work with them. So by being able to better understand trust levels, we'll better understand how to shape our futures. As I said, the Trust Barometer has evolved over 14 years. In 2001, we saw the rising influence of NGOs. In 2005, we started to see trust shifting from authorities to peers, and that was a dramatic shift. And that was probably the beginning of social media being able to take shape. Where you really saw the impact of social media showing up in this study was 2006, where a person like me emerges as a more credible spokesperson than the CEO or than the leader of government, because you had access to information that you never had access before. In 2009, we saw business must partner with government to regain trust. And in 2013, we saw a real crisis of leadership, that there was trust in the institutions, but not so much trust in leadership. 2014, as we said, led to the opportunity for business to begin to lead the debate for change. So, why are businesses in this unique position now? Because for the first time in a long time, in most countries in the world, including Canada, we trust business more than we trust government. What this chart shows you is over the years that we've measured trust in business and trust in government, there hasn't been much of a gap in Canada. Canadians trust their government and they trust their business. And then what you see here, the difference between 2013, where it was even, and 2014 is an 11-point trust gap. Now, interestingly, if you look at the same results for the United States, it's almost double the gap in the U.S. And we attribute that to, in Canada, we think the trust gap tended to be driven by scandal, whereas the trust gap in the U.S. tended to be driven by things not functioning, government shutting down, people not getting paid, government services not being given because of the collapse of trust in government. Canada, by and large, is a nation of trusters. So if we split the world into three categories, distrusters, neutrals, and trusters, we see countries like the U.S., France, Japan tend to be in the distruster category. Japan used to be in the most trusted category, but after the nuclear issues of a few years ago, the trust in Japan has just fallen by the wayside. Canada is a nation of trusters, and what we see is Canada is one of the few countries that moved up in trust in 2014. So, what are the factors that really shape trust? Well, one of them is that Canada still values traditional media. If you look in the study, you will see in some countries, traditional media is no longer the most trusted of the media sources. And that doesn't mean media usage, it means trust in the brand or trust in the source of media. And in Canada is one of the few countries where we still trust our Globe and Mail, our CTVs, our CBCs more than we trust the newer forms of media. What is really important to understand is how important search engines are here. And search engines are more trusted than traditional media globally as the first source for general business information, the first source for breaking news, and the source used to confirm and validate news and information. And that is true in Canada as well. So what that tells us is that we need to be careful to make sure that the information we are putting out there is eminently shareable and eminently findable so that people have access to it. There are four key factors that shape trust in business. What industry sector you're in, what your country of origin is, what your enterprise type is, and what your leadership or who your leadership is. And those four areas seem to shape trust more than any others. So if we look at that, in terms of industry sector, the most trusted sector for all 14 years in almost every country in the world, including Canada, is people trust the technology sector. Now, we believe that is because people see technology as being in the surprise and delight business. If you get a new iPhone, you're thrilled. If you get a new BlackBerry, you're thrilled. If you get a new Samsung TV, you're thrilled. Technology allows us to do things that surprise and delight us. That's not true in all of the other sectors we look at. So 2014, if you see technology at the top, you see the chemical industry at the bottom. You see pharmaceuticals are more challenged than consumer electronics manufacturing. One interesting thing to note here that is very different for Canada than it is for anywhere else in the world is the trust in banks, which is in the middle of the pack here. Trust in banks in Canada is very strong relative to the rest of the world. The rest of the world still has not forgiven banks for what happened in 2008 and 2009. And so you would see them as being one of the least trusted sectors in all of the areas. Okay, so let's look at trust by country. And what we see when we look at trust by country is we have Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, and Canada as the most trusted countries of origin. So that means do you trust the company whose head office is in Canada or Sweden or Germany? Globally, people trust those countries the most. Conversely, they trust the BRIC nations the least. So what does that mean? That means if you are a Canadian company selling your goods and services outside of Canada, you should probably be making a much bigger deal about being a Canadian company because it helps you be trusted more. Conversely, if you're doing an acquisition in Mexico or Brazil or Russia, you need to think through the ramifications it's going to have, because people are not necessarily going to see that as a trusted move. In that companies that come from those countries are less trusted than companies that come from other countries. Okay, so let's look at trust perception by type of enterprise. And this year, for the first year ever, we looked at the difference between publicly traded companies and privately held companies. And it was fascinating to see the results. If you look at things like responsive to customer needs, entrepreneurial, more innovative, responsive to employees' needs, responsive to society's needs, act responsibly, think long-term, all of those perceptions are higher amongst privately held companies than they are amongst publicly traded companies. Which means that if you are a privately held company, you may have a trust advantage in the market over a publicly traded company. And if the only places that publicly traded companies outscored or outranked privately held companies were in terms of being more transparent, were in terms of having more political influence. So, let's look at who are the most trusted spokespeople for your company. And what we did was look at everything from academics to technical experts to financial experts to people like me to government officials to employees to NGO representatives, because those are all people who can speak on your behalf and allow you to put forth your message from someone other than just a media spokesperson. The least trusted are government officials, board of directors, and CEOs, which are pretty scary. This is the first year we've ever measured board of directors, and board of directors are seen as an extension of a CEO as opposed to as someone who's watching over the CEO. When we look at how can we build trust, we need to look at who can help us build that trust. So let us go back a couple of slides for a minute. And what we see in order, that the most trusted of all the people are academic experts. They are seen to be the least tied to anybody. They are seen to having their own opinion. Technical experts are ranked very highly. In some industries, financial experts. We already talked about the importance of people like me. NGO representatives may be helpful or may not be helpful. depending on the situation. Employees are always helpful. Government officials, less so. And as you saw in the previous slide, CEOs, board of directors, and government leaders are the lowest. So when we're figuring out who should speak for the company and who should be telling our story, we need to look at this and look at and go, is there an academic expert who can tell our story? Is there a person like me or an employee who can better tell the story? Because if the CEO is the least trusted, then we need to be going to the area where the most trusted. Now, all of this depends on having a real story and a true story. You can't make this stuff up, and you can't spin your way out of it. So let's carry on. So how do we build trust beyond that? What we've looked at is the attributes that make people trust, and we split them into 5 categories: engagement, integrity, products and services, purpose, and operations. Those 5 categories are ranked in order of importance. So operations 10 years ago was the most important. Did you make a profit? Did you have a good CEO? Did you have a good year? Did you behave properly? That was the most important area. What we've seen evolve over the last 8 to 10 years is the importance of purpose. What is the purpose for the company beyond just making products? Do you make products and services that are wonderful, or do you just make products and services that are average? Do you do it with integrity? And most importantly, what sort of engagement does your company have? What sort of engagement does your CEO have? So those elements became the key to becoming more trusted. So let me illustrate that. So if we look at this chart, and on the left-hand side, we look at things in terms of most important to least important. And on the right-hand side, we look at in terms of our performance, greatest performance to less performance. What we see is we are strongest in products and services and operations. That's what the Trust Barometer is telling us. And yet, if you remember to the previous slide, the 2 most important things for driving trust are engagement and integrity. And when we look at those, we see that they're the most important, but they are the lowest performance area that we have. So how do we focus on those 2 areas? Well, we do it by things like proving that we listen to customer needs and feedback, that we treat our employees well, that places customers ahead of profits and communicates frequently and honestly on the state of its business. In terms of integrity, we look at it in terms of having ethical business practices, taking responsible actions to address an issue or a crisis, and having transparent and open business practices. So again, think about those things in terms of your company and your opportunity, and think about who you would use, what people would be best talking about those things for you. Treating employees well, for example, is that best talked about by a CEO, or is that best talked about by an employee who can say, I'm treated well? I think we know it's the latter. So, if you want to build trust, we need to ensure quality control in products. We need to protect customer data. We need to respect employee rights. We need to be responsible supply chain management. And we need to pay appropriate levels of taxes. If we want to destroy trust, there's an easy map. We can do unethical business practices. We can fail to keep customers' info secure. We can be irresponsible during a crisis. And we can have substandard working condition, and we can misrepresent the company. It's a very clear path here. So, going back to that, who should tell our story and which story? what this chart shows us is if you look at engagement, who is the best person to talk about engagement? If you look at integrity, who are the best people to talk about? And what you see here is the CEO is important to talk about him, but not the most important talked about. And the least important person across the board in Canada is the media spokesperson. So when we're sitting there thinking we need to deal with tough issues, and we need to deal with things that are affecting how people think of us, we need to be dealing with them with the right people. One of the scariest things in the entire Edelman Trust Barometer is the lack of trust in government leaders and CEOs. And it tends to revolve around the whole notion of telling the truth, of being ethical and moral, of doing the right things, of being responsible to correct issues that need correcting, of solving social issues. And if you look at these scores where government officials, 7% of Canadians expect government officials to tell the truth, 9% expect CEOs to tell the truth, the numbers are absolutely horrific, which is why it becomes a problem if the CEO is the only spokesperson who is capable of fixing a problem. We need to have other people who are more trusted to be able to help out in these situations. So, how can your CEO build trust? Again, the research tells us pretty conclusively, communicate clearly and transparently. Tell the truth no matter how complex or how unpopular. Be front and center during challenging times. Engage regularly with employees to discuss the state of business. Be personally involved in local charities and good causes. And have an active media presence. Don't shy away from media. It's funny when we go through the study with CEOs go, oh, well, people don't trust us, so we shouldn't be doing anything. And that's not true. There are very clear things that CEOs can be doing to build trust in this world. So what important things can we do with this trust as leaders? We think there's a real opportunity for leadership in business and leadership in government to be chief engagement officers, to focus on getting people engaged, to focus on putting customer needs ahead of profits, to focus on employee retention and employee well-being. All of these things add to the complexity of being a leader, but also add to the importance of the role in society today. So how do we evolve? Well, we need to evolve from everything being micro to macro. We need to evolve from our dealings with customers just from being transactional to being that one of shared values. We need to evolve from just doing what's legally required to what are societal expectations. And we need to evolve from doing the what to the how and why. And how do we do that? We believe we've got to participate.